Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. All right, friends, thank you again for joining us today. I'm here with my co-host, Matt Ma, and we're really excited to have as guest on this show, the International Director for the Americas, serving with a mission organization called OMF, John Fuller. John, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be here.
So John, for some of you guys who may know, is someone that I've known really my whole life. So he's actually an Uncle John to me, and I'm doing my best to call him John today. But if you hear Uncle John partway through the program and are trying to figure out if he's my biological uncle, it's one of the blessings of life on the mission field is there's a lot of women who are uncles and aunts. But John, yeah, we're excited to talk through some things today with you, really boiling down to this concept of the adventure of following God's calling in your life. But before we dive into that, we'd love to get to know you a little bit more. So could you give us just a thumbnail sketch of what your life has been about, who you are, and what you do vocationally?
Sure. I'm glad to be here. I've enjoyed every conversation that Luke and I have ever had, and that we've had some strange ones in strange places over the years. So this is great. Yeah. So I grew up in the Philippines. My parents were missionaries there. So I was what we call a third culture kid. Really look back on that experience mostly positively. There were lots of hard things. Spent a lot of time in boarding schools away from my family, but also really learned a lot about who God is, and by watching my parents. Studied philosophy and history at York University, and that was an opportunity to figure out if I really did believe in Jesus for myself, or was it just kind of what I'd grown up in. And I'll tell a little bit more about that in a minute. I think I met Marilyn, my wife, there. We were both involved in InterVarsity, and InterVarsity was huge for us, InterVarsity, and I think this is true of any student groups and campus. But studying philosophy and history, I really embraced the whole idea that all truth is God's truth, and so I could dive into philosophy and history and learn without fear. And Ivy taught me that. We were married just at the end of university, and ended up, much to my surprise, really, I wanted to be a philosophy professor. That was my dream. I wanted to be C.S. Lewis, but God challenged me with just who was making decisions in this life. And he challenged me with the verse that says, to him as whom much has been given, much will be required, and just asked how much I valued my upbringing in missions. And so he said, will you let me use that? So we ended up as church planters in the Philippines, and working with Muslims down in the southern Philippines, and great experience there of just seeing God go before us really unexpectedly. God gave us 3 daughters who were raised in a village with no electricity and no running water. Lots of challenges there. My wife is an amazing woman. She's a hero. So right in the middle of all that, we were there about 12 years, and then God gave me the gift of cancer. And we suddenly had to just uproot and head home. And that was, I thought we would be, Muslim church planters for life. And God shifted that around, released me, got me out of the way, I would say, so that Filipinos could really take over, and redirected my life into mobilization, to just come alongside people and helping them really explore what God was calling them to do and to be. And that became eventually an international role, as I was part of OMF and the international leadership team based in Singapore. Got me involved in what was happening globally with the church. Amazing privilege to be wandering around the world in different continents. I learned a lot about God and the church. And since 2013, I've been back here in Canada, still working with OMF. OMF is focused on East Asia's peoples, work with different groups all across East Asia and globally with East Asia's peoples. So I'm now on the international leadership team, but responsible for the Americas. So US, Canada, Latin America. Love what's going on in those parts of the world. And I love canoeing and sailing. I love the outdoors. Being here in Canada is great. I love sailing because it's a spiritual experience. It's about learning to read the wind, respond to it. That's been a great metaphor for me of how we live responsive to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, wow. And as you've told us a bit about your life, maybe you could get into something more specific about some relationships or experiences that have really formed your sense of calling in what you've been a part of.
You know, there's lots of folk, and I have friends who grew up with parents, missionary parents, and that was really hard. And I understand that for some that's a really been a bitter experience. But I just feel really blessed with my parents and with the way God led. And some of that was just seeing my parents live a life of faith in very concrete terms. I remember
Mm.
lying on a bamboo floor in a house, a tribal village way out in the middle of nowhere in the southern Philippines. I was about maybe 15, 16. I was on survey with my dad. He invited me to come along. And we were in the most important man's house in the village. And he was the spirit doctor, the witch doctor. And I'm lying there with my dad. It's dark. There's no lights. And he's chanting, right? There's just a curtain between us. And he's casting demons or something out of some lady beside us. And I remember lying there and understanding the spiritual kind of conflict there, but not being afraid because my dad was with me. And I knew and had confidence in my dad's understanding of who God is. And I could lie there and know that God was big enough, that God was present in this moment. And, that experience has stuck with me. I went to university, studied philosophy and history. People said, don't study philosophy, you'll lose your faith. And I remember thinking to myself, if my faith is that easy to lose, then it's not really mine.
Yeah.
I have to make it my faith. So, and those years in philosophy were really challenging. I was completely naive in the challenges I was going to have to deal with. Professors challenging me as a Christian, trying to learn how to stand up.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sitting in the basement of York University, the library there, trying to write a paper on moral philosophy to prove that God exists, which is not an easy thing to do, not something you can do logically. And I'm just in despair. I remember just being in despair because I just could not logically get to God. And in the midst of my despair, suddenly realized I was praying. And I thought, wait, so actually I believe in God, even though I'm not sure I believe in God. And as I began to look at why, I realized that one of the reasons I believed in God was, to be honest, it was people whose lives had given me a stake in the ground. OMF retirees. I used to go to an OMF prayer meeting. I was the youngest person there by 50 years. I'd go every week. These old saints of God, they'd come in with their walkers through the snow and they would pray up a storm. I never prayed. Wouldn't have dreamed of praying. I mean, these guys, these were people way beyond me spiritually, I always thought. They loved having me there because I brought the age down. So they hated the tea, milky tea. But I went every week because I remember thinking this: when I get to be old, I want to be like them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be someone who knows God and whose life has made a difference.
Yeah.
And I think, as I said, we ended up in a Muslim community, and I think the lesson for me, that formative event, was it was a big deal for me as a foreigner and as a follower of Jesus to be invited to live in a Muslim community. And we didn't know how God was going to do that. And as we prayed and worked, and we did surveys and we visited all over, visited hundreds of Muslim communities, never found a community that was really willing to invite us. But all the way through that 2-year period of surveys and praying and spiritual warfare, we were going to a beach resort on the island where we were living, and a beautiful white sand beach. And eventually one of our friends from the church, a lovely lady, Ati Dolores, she said, there's a Muslim community right behind that beach resort. I said, nah. Stupid thing to say, right? She's lived on this island all her life, right? And she said, yeah, John, there is. So Meryl and I, we got in our little motorbike and we went wandering off through the jungle, followed our directions, and we end up in this little community. Sure enough, there's a mosque. And I asked the guy, is this, kind of community? He says, yeah, it's a Muslim community. And so we got talking, took some pictures, because you can't get lost twice, right? You can only get lost once. And then, but with pictures, you can go back. So, because you want to get copies. So I went back, took some pictures, and we got talking. And these guys, I was actually in the beach resort with my wife, and she was pretty pregnant at that point. So I said, I'll go up the hill, you pray. So I'm walking out the back of the beach resort. I've got these pictures. Some of the guys that I knew from 2 years built relationships. They said, "Hey, where are you going, John?" I said, "Hey, I'm just going up the hill." And they said, "Well, why would you want to do that?" I said, "There's a village up there." And they said, "Yeah, why are you going?" I said, "Well, I've got these pictures. I want to give copies to some folk. We ended up there." And they said, "Oh, let's see the pictures." And they started laughing and talking in Cebuano, the Filipino language. And they said, "Oh, that's our brother. That's my." Turns out
Hmm.
every single person in this beach resort was a Muslim from the tribal group that we were interested in. And for 2 years, I'd been building friendships with them.
Oh, wow.
And I had no idea. And I've been praying that God would open doors for us to get into this village. And God had it all under control, but he knew that if I knew, I'd wreck it, right? I would have blown it, because it was because of the relationships we'd built. Because of the chief said to me, "Yeah, you can come live with us. We've watched you for 2 years. We saw you treat your wife. We saw you don't drink. We saw you're respectful." And they actually, one of my friends gave me their home. And that's how and I just learned in that moment that, when God calls you to something, he opens the doors. In fact, we
Yeah.
called the village, the name we gave it was Little Door.
Hmm.
Uh,
And
I
one of the beautiful things about following God is when there's a beach thrown in right by. That's
Yeah,
even better.
absolutely. We had to be careful about the pictures we took, right? Because
Yes.
it couldn't like do. Um, yeah, I think another issue for me is just the experience of cancer.
Mm.
I was 40 when I was diagnosed with cancer. Huge surprise. We were evacuated out in 5 days. But I had the privilege at 40 of sitting on a 747 flying out of Manila and asking myself, has my life meant anything?
Yeah.
Has it been enough? And I think that's a question you ask in your 70s or 80s or but it was a really good question for me to ask at 40. And I had to sit down and really think, have I followed Jesus carefully enough? Have I held on to the adventure? And at that point I could say, oh, I got so many regrets, but I have seen God, and he's been faithful, and I wouldn't trade it. And that's what, we had to leave the Muslim work behind, and we got involved in mobilization. But that was just the opportunity to come alongside other people
Yeah.
and to see what they're doing. Uh,
When you think about asking yourself that question, that's a huge question. It's one of those questions that I feel my heart kind of like when you say it. Um, what did that wrestling process on that 747 flying out of Manila, thinking about that, like, what did that look like a little bit more in detail? Because I think a lot of people are asking themselves that question today.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, some of that is, are you willing to really be honest with yourself? And I had to sort of go back and pay attention to some things in my life. And what what you realize pretty quickly is a lot of the things that show up in the media or that people say are important, they don't measure up to that moment.
Yeah.
We when we were our kids came home, because we grew up in the Philippines. We didn't even have a TV for a lot of our life. We came home to Canada every once in a while for a year or so, and our kids were just glued to the TV. They just could not. I mean, I'm still like that. I can't take my. And so we played a game called Spot the Lie.
Hmm.
Where every time there were advertisements come on, we would say, "Okay, spot the lie," because we wanted our kids to think about. And there's so many things that we're told that are what life is about. But when you don't know if you're going to be dead in a month,
Mm.
most of those go away, and you're left with, have I influenced people so that they understand better who they are, and they have found something that matters for eternity?
Mm.
And in my understanding of the world, that means that they need to find a relationship with God, because he's the one for whom eternity is home.
Yeah.
It's as we walk with God that we find ourselves comfortable in the whole concept of eternity.
Yeah.
And that means being really ruthless about the things in our lives that keep us from that dynamic, vibrant adventure with God.
Wow. Yeah. As
I
David
love that
Platt would say,
even.
go ahead, man.
Oh, sorry, buddy. I love that even at the beginning of your story, when you're in those prayer meetings with those older men and women, to be able to say, like, whatever they're living for, that real example of a life well lived,
Mm.
uh, influenced you so much so that you would walk that same path. And in reflecting on that question, uh, then you turn around and be that person to somebody else. That's pretty incredible.
And
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't we all want to be, when we're old? I mean, I am old, but we want to be that for others, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As I think
Yeah.
David Platt was the one that said, To live in such a way that demonstrates to the world that Jesus is someone worth losing everything for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man, well said.
Yeah.
John, you've given us some awesome stories already, but would love to maybe unpack that adventure you mentioned a moment ago, in just asking how have you seen God's calling on your life truly be that adventure? Because obviously you've acknowledged adversity, the
Mm.
challenge of finding firstly even that village to get connected and serving in, then cancer, but I think you've seen God do amazing things in that process. So how is God's calling on your life truly being that adventure, not just of fun, but of real purpose?
Mm. I remember sitting in the back of a car. I think I was traveling with my dad and another OMF missionary. Luke, you'd know Helen Bacon,
Yeah,
missionary in
great
Thailand
woman.
for many years, just lived life to the full. And I was just along to carry the books on some mission trip we were doing. I was like in 20 or 21. And I heard Helen say to my dad, "I'm so glad that God called me to be a missionary." And my dad said,
Mhm.
"Why?" And I'm like, I'm in, right? I'm in the conversation. I want to know. And Helen said, and I've never forgotten this, she said, I think I think if I just had not obeyed God in that calling, I could have handled my life. I could have controlled, made decisions, and managed everything that would have happened to me. But when I chose to obey God, and it's not just about being a missionary, it's any time we obey God. Helen said, He took me way beyond myself
Mhm.
Mm,
into stuff that I could never have handled on my own. And because of that, I had to lean on Him. I was desperate. And in that desperation, I learned about Him in ways I never would have before. And I've never forgotten that. And that story has lived with me for years afterwards. And to me, that's part of why we want to hold on to God, because when we hold on to God in that way, we discover who He truly is and who we truly are. And so as part of that, I mean, I mentioned we lived in a Muslim context. It was an unreached people group in the southern Philippines. There were two known Christians when we moved in the early 90s, and neither of them are living in a Muslim context.
Mhm.
Today there's hundreds of believers in that
yeah.
context. And I never led a Muslim to Christ, and I never was able to see a Muslim become a follower of Jesus in my context. We left before any of that happened, and yet we had a part. We had a part to play. Our Filipino friends, who were really the ones that saw that movement come into birth and take place, they said to us two things. So they learned. They said, John, we learned from you in Maryland that as Christians we could live in a Muslim context. I mean, Muslims and Christians in the Philippines have been fighting a war for hundreds of years, and so for Christians to choose to live in a Muslim context was just really, really challenging. And they watched us and said, "Oh, Christians can do that." And then they said, the second thing we learned is that we can do it a lot better than you can. They
Yeah.
just watched us struggle with culture and language and all this stuff. And they said, you know what, we should be doing that. And God has used them. So,
Mhm.
you don't get to choose how God uses you, but
Mm,
if you're into the adventure, He'll surprise you, but He will always use you.
yeah.
Mhm.
Another part for me that came a bit later in life was as God began to just give me an option to be involved globally, and I got to travel. I got to hang out with God's people in different parts of the world and see the amazing things that God is doing through His church and the
Yeah.
different things He's doing.
Hmm.
That became a huge. I once took communion on 3 consecutive Sundays in 3 different continents. So I
Wow.
was in Hong Kong for a service there and just was able to be with a Chinese church and worship with them, and they took communion there. And then I flew from Hong Kong to Johannesburg, and we were there for a commissioning of a missionary, and it was all in Afrikaans. Didn't understand a lot, but we took communion with
Mm,
God's people in Afrikaans in that church in Johannesburg. And then from there, I flew on to Sao Paulo, and I was in a little house church, and I took communion. And the guy who's leading the service asked me to just lead the communion. And I just got up and told the story about the differences in culture, different ways we did communion, different languages, but all God's people in
Mhm.
those 3 continents. Amazing experience of just the global nature of God. And the funny thing was, I sat down after communion in that little house church, and it was packed. There were like 60 people in this church, on the stairs and everywhere. And the pastor got up and he began to just preach in Portuguese. And,
mm,
and he was like weeping. And I didn't understand a word, but the guy beside me, he was translating, and he's just translating the pastor saying, we're so grateful for missionaries who's come. And then he starts just saying something, And before, my friend he didn't have time to translate. He just said, "Look out." And I look up, and the whole church is coming at us. You know, men, women, children, and they're just weeping and they're hugging us. I got kids hugging my legs. I'm an Asian, right? This is really awkward for me. I got grown women crying on my shoulders, and they're just saying, "Thank you, thank you." And Steve says to me, the pastor just said, "You know, years ago, missionaries came to our country and brought the good news of Jesus Christ. These are not those missionaries, but let's thank them as an example of what it means to bring the gospel into a land." And I felt so humbled, but
Yeah.
also realized the power of the calling of God when we obey.
Yeah. Wow.
Maybe, yeah.
Uh,
The other thing I
I,
would just say is I just don't want to make it all about big things. One of the moments when I think it's been an adventure is being on a canoe trip, solo canoe trip, sitting out and watching the stars come out at night, and just understanding that God is very big and that he is beautiful, and that's what the world says to us. Those moments are also part of the adventure.
yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Stargazing on a lake is fantastic.
It was such a still night that the water was perfectly calm, and I could see the reflection of the stars in the water as clearly as I could in the sky. Never.
Oh, wow.
Wow. A quick question on a thing you said a minute ago. You just talked about the Filipino locals who took over for you, serving in that village, and talked about their effectiveness in that context. And I think that's an intriguing concept because I know a lot of people today are saying like, well, maybe we can just put money into locals being equipped, and people aren't thinking so much about they themselves going from South Africa or England or America or Canada or where have you to those settings and actually giving or teaching a really specific skill set for reaching people missionally. What are your thoughts on that kind of shifting dynamic, both of empowering locals, whether it's Filipinos or Japanese, et cetera, to be missionaries in their own context, as well as with the need that's still there for people to in Australia or New Zealand or France or Canada to say, yes, I'll go. How do you see that working itself out?
Yeah, great question. And so I really believe that this is a both and, not an either or. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that's true. One, the whole colonial history of missions, there's some wonderful stuff there and great people, but any idea that we are somehow the owners of the gospel and we go take it over there just misunderstands the whole
Mm-hmm.
nature of the gospel. God
Yeah.
has a mission, he's on mission, we're joining him. So he's at work already there in lots of different ways. And actually, my experience with mission is that as I obeyed God, it was more about what he wanted to do in me than what happened as a result. That was all his problem. I'm the beneficiary of that. But I think the second thing is that when we talk to, I mean, locals, the whole global local thing, I really don't buy. I think it's a false dichotomy.
Hmm.
Wherever I am is my local, and God has called me to obey him to be wherever he calls me to be. And that point, that's my local. That's my responsibility. But I do really believe that, and this is what I see is that when we look at this, it's always about partnership. My Filipino friends, sure, they said we can do some things better, but they also said, but God used you as well. And they're not saying don't send us any more foreigners. They're just saying send people who will partner so we can work together. Because I think that's the other part of this is the really important recognition is that all of us have a local responsibility, right? And so I have a responsibility here in Toronto to think about who is not able to hear the gospel in my context.
Hmm.
How am I crossing those barriers? So this responsibility for God's mission is always about being responsible locally and then also understanding the global context. There are some places where there is no local option because there are no local believers. Someone's got to go and be sent. And the final thing I'd say is that the command to go and to be as we go to make disciples, the concern for God's glory amongst the nations is for all of us. It's not just so I can't absolve myself of that responsibility by sending my money somewhere else. I have to, every one of us as followers of Jesus has to ask, what is my calling? What is my responsibility? And then obey that. And that might mean giving, it might mean praying, it might mean going.
Hmm.
No one gets to say, I'll give, but I won't go. That's a conversation you need to have with Jesus.
And what would you say are some of the ways you've discerned that calling? What are some of the ways you've listened to the Spirit of God?
Frequently, because God had to hammer me over the head. So I know good people who journeyed with me, but it's always been an invitation. Our sense of calling to that specific people group was actually, we had obeyed enough to be in the Philippines, but we weren't sure where we were supposed to be assigned. And I remember standing on a beach outside of a Muslim community, and Jesus, just really having a sense of God saying, I'm at work here and I can use you here if you're willing. It was an
Mm,
invitation. It wasn't this kind of ching like that. It was just, I'm at work here, and there was a sense that it could have been somewhere else, but it was an invitation to just join God in what he was doing. And I honestly believe this calling thing is, I'm passionate about the notion of being called, but I think we're all called. And I think it's overhyped as this sort of, if you're serious about obeying Jesus and you follow him, he wants you to be where he wants you to be more than you do. And you will not be able to avoid it if you're committed to obedience. He will
mm,
get you there.
mm.
Won't be what you expected, but he will accomplish his purposes. So don't make the calling a big deal. Just make Jesus the big deal.
Yeah.
I love that. I love how you had that personal experience where you were able to really sense God's direction, and that even like the encouragement there wasn't, if you don't follow, this is what will happen, but just like a really passionate but invitation into the goodness, the good life that God has for you.
Into the
Um,
adventure.
yeah, and you also mentioned just how other people played a part in that. Maybe you could speak to, you've shared with Luke and I just a bit of a philosophy of ministry or a life uh, motto. Um,
Mm.
how does that kind of roll out into this concept of helping others determine what God is calling them into?
Yeah. So my life kind of vision statement for years has been to do everything I can to help others become everything God has called them to be. That's what really excites me when I can see that happen. And that's because others did that for me. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember Mr. Timmons, art teacher, never took a class with him. He was a really eccentric individual. Uh, he he was a teacher at Faith Academy in the Philippines, and he had this a Sea Scouts group, like a scouting group, and it was not a cool place for cool kids. You were cool if you were good at athletics or smart. I was neither, but he had no concept of the impossible. So he had this group, and he got us sailing boats. He got crappy broken boats from Manila Yacht Club. They dumped them in the school compound, and he said, you can fix those. We said, no, we can't. He said, yes, you can. I said, no, we can't. He said, he sat in a chair and watched us and made us keep working, and we rebuilt these boats. He got us real US Navy uniforms from the US Navy. They had to be trimmed to size, and he got us dressed in these things, and then he forced us to learn color marching, with flags and stuff. And then he got us assigned to the US Embassy as the color guard. I was doing color guard duty at 18 for the US Embassy. And
In
then he got
Manila.
the US Navy ship. He persuaded the recruiters who had a budget to pay for our trip. Never mind that virtually none of us were US citizens. And so we're on the ship, and I'm in a full captain's dress at this point. I've got US Navy sailors saluting me and then saying, excuse me, sir, but who the heck are you? And this just went on and on. I mean, he had us trained by the paramedics from Clark Air Force Base. These are the guys that parachute into the jungle and do brain surgery on a banana leaf. We were trained in advanced search and rescue. And then he told the government that we were available to get called out. The point of all that, though, was he believed in us. And I very distinctly remember at the end of my grade 12 year, we were at some event and we were lined up in our uniforms and stuff. And he brought out a medal and he pinned it on my chest. And he said, this is a distinguished service medal to represent the leadership you'd brought to this group. And I remember God saying to me at that moment, I've given you leadership gifts if you'll use them for me. I still have the medal. It's sitting over on the shelf, just a crack. I think he got it out of a Cracker Jack box or something, but he invested in me. My university staff worker who taught me that I could be a public speaker and gave me opportunities, put me out in front of university professors and just said, just do your thing, and supported me, encouraged me. The first superintendent for me when we arrived in the southern Philippines, I was a naive, idealistic. I was going to save the world. I was going to be the apostle to this people group. I had tons of stupid ideas, and he never, ever said, that's a stupid idea. He would just ask me good questions. And after about 10 minutes, I'd say, this isn't really a great idea, is it? And he said, well, maybe not, but he supported me, gave me room to learn. And we're still best friends. In fact, I'm his boss now. We've worked together over the years. So people have invested in me. And I think that's, for me, that's God's heart for his people. That's what God does for us and what he wants us to do for each other. You know, Ephesians 2:10 says we are God's workmanship, prepared for good works that he has ordained for us, that he's prepared for us. And so those are the adventures that God plans for us. And we're invited into those, and we have the opportunity to invite others. And I guess the last reason is just it's so much fun.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, when we can come alongside someone and just encourage them, say a few words. I remember having a barbecue with someone. They just had a bunch of questions about life and missions, and they came over to our house. Years later, she said to me, that conversation is what helped me understand that God wanted me to be in Indonesia.
Wow.
And she gave years of her life there. And often you just don't know. I remember being at Bethel Church in Kingston, and I was there to do a missionary moment. And they said 3 minutes, you know, but right before the service, the minister came to me and said, we're really tight on time, going to be really tight. Can you just cut it down to 1 minute? And I'm like,
Wow.
come on, I drove all the way. Come on, you know, great church, Bethel. And, but I had a 1 minute module. So I got up, I stood up, and I did my 1 minute module, and I sat back down. The pastor said to me after the service, I wouldn't have believed you could have done it. I didn't expect you to do 1 minute. But, you know, 12 years later, I'm in Singapore for an orientation course training new missionaries. And a Canadian comes up to me and says, do you remember me? I said, no. She said, I was at this church in Kingston, Bethel Church, on a Sunday. And you got up and you just told one story. And that story is what God used in my life to challenge me to get serious with him about missions. And I mean, most of the time we don't get to know that, but when we do, it's massive, because it's not about us, right? It's just that we've had a chance to participate in God doing something in someone's life. I've had people say to me, you know, as they're getting on the plane, John, because of you, I'm going to the mission field. I hate that. That terrifies me. 2 years later, they're going to say, this sucks. And it's because of you, John, that I'm here, right? It can't be that. It's always got to be because of God. But we get to be part of that. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't you want to do that? Why isn't that an adventure everyone wants to be part of?
Mm-hmm. To inspire people to see their lives as not only playing a role in God's kingdom mission, but being used by God to have an eternal impact on the lives of other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, so well said. So, in light of that, and we talk about those moments where you've had the privilege of saying something or giving a brief message and it's really inspired someone, God's used that to galvanize someone's hearts towards having really seeing themselves as living on mission, whether that's in their local context or internationally in their then new local context. What would you say to people who are listening, whether they're youth or young adults, especially who might be thinking about their future, or even somebody that might be later on in life, who think that, yeah, following Jesus might be reduced to a Bible study on Wednesdays and church on Sunday mornings and really isn't all that exciting?
Yeah, you know, I don't get upset about a lot of stuff, but I get upset when I encounter bored Christians, because if you're a follower of Jesus, you can't be bored. I mean, it sells God short and it sells you short. I think there's so many adventures out there. I had a guy call me up, this is some years ago. He said, I'm 55. You know, I've had a successful career. I just sold my business. I can take early retirement. My house is paid off. I got 2 cars. Kids are finished university. And I just thought maybe I wanted to call someone up, thought I could call you and just ask about doing something significant with my life. You know, and part of me was like, great, let's have that conversation. But another part of me was like, 55 years. Like,
Yeah.
why are we only having this conversation now? You know, that's just so, yeah, you know, the God, I mean, Abraham in Genesis 15, God took him outside and showed him the stars to give him a sense of the future, you know, to give him the vision. Like I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy because I deliberately nurture my sense of wonder. Because
Mm.
there's something I worry about with evangelicals today. It's that we don't have a big enough understanding of who God is. We're not consumed with, well, we get our theology right, but we put God in a nice, comfortable box, and he doesn't scare us or awe us enough. And so we need that sense of wonder. You know, following Jesus isn't just about finding freedom from the ravages of sin. It's certainly that, but it's being invited to become fully human, to really understand what it means to be the image of God. We're made in the image of God. You know, our heritage, our future is beyond, it's in eternity. It's just beyond anything we can conceive of. And if you accept that invitation to the glory of God, that image of God, and to let God frame you into that, then yes, as you're dealing with it, you're going to have to deal with sin, just because it keeps you from being able to become everything that is that glory of God. And he will use you to challenge others to that fullness of life, and to invite them to deal with sin. But the focus of our lives is on the invitation to be everything God has made us to be. And yeah, that's why wouldn't you live? That's not boring.
Yeah, it's the last thing that you would think of as boring. Could you speak a little bit more to that? Because what you just said a minute ago about putting God in a box and not having a sense of either awe or even like healthy fear of who God is. How do you think you nurture that?
Partly by not avoiding the hard questions. I think
Hmm.
too often our theologizing is to be sure we have all the answers, so we can be comfortable and complacent. And you know, I've studied theology. I've been to seminary. I'm all about understanding the truth of the gospel. But ultimately, Jesus said, "I am the truth." So I'm more interested in a living relationship with Him
Mm.
than I am in propositional truths. And you know, one of my favorite philosophers is a guy not well known called Nicholas of Cusa, who wrote a book on uncertainty. It's just called On Uncertainty. And his basic thesis was that the desire for certainty can actually get in the way of us knowing and loving God.
Mm.
Because God, there is just so much mystery and so much wonder. And I hope that our theologizing points us to the mystery of God, and that is not a fearful thing, because we trust Him and He loves us and He holds on to us. And then we can go out into the world without fear. And when we're faced with big questions, we have a bigger God, and we can sit down and we can, in community. I mean, that's why we sit down in community and we ask those questions of each other. And Jesus promised the Holy Spirit would be the one who would teach us of all truth. So, you know, you can't read the Bible separate from the Spirit of God being there to apply it. So
I love that. Maybe you can speak to, we deal with a lot of kids who even this year are dealing with a decision of what university to choose, what career path to take. And uh, does everybody have to become a missionary in East Asia? Maybe you should say yes because of your job. But
no.
what does it mean for all of us to follow Jesus?
Yeah, no, everybody does not. In fact, the only ones who should become missionaries in East Asia are the ones who can't do anything else as they obey God. You know, because but the question, the point is, you know, all of us should be asking God, what is it you're calling me to do? And then trusting Him to show you the way, trusting Him to go before you and open those doors. Uh, and He wants that more than we do. And so if we're serious about that, He will get us where we need to be. You know, God called us to work with Muslims. That's not everyone's calling by any means. But interestingly, I had a clear sense, and by clear, I just mean that it came to me while I was reading scripture. I just had a sense of Islam being something that God was laying on my heart. I went to OMF leadership 3 times and said, I think God is calling us to be missionaries with Muslims. And 3 times they said no. And they said no because they knew me. I remember one of our leaders saying, John, you're a great guy and you have a passion and you inspire people. But when you work with Muslims, nothing happens forever and you will die. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. and I accepted that. I trusted them. And you know, but then 5 years later, God prompted us again, and we went to the OMF leader at that point. And at that point, the leader said, yeah, I think you should do this. I was furious. I thought, well, wait a minute. Hey, but what I didn't know was that because of circumstances in the Philippines, if we had followed that calling to Muslim work, we would have ended up on a team that self-destructed and blew up a year later.
Hmm.
But because we went to the Philippines not knowing we weren't going to work with Muslims, in the end, we were able to serve them uh, with a team that we started, and that was exactly the place God wanted us to be. And so as I look back on that, I would just want to say, if you're serious about obeying God, even though it seems like the direction is opposite to what you'd expect, if you cling hold to God, if you trust in him with all your heart, don't lean on your own understanding, acknowledge him in all your ways, he will direct your paths. He will not, you cannot end up in the wrong place if you're serious about following Jesus.
Hmm.
You can end up in places that feel like they're the wrong place, but God will be faithful. He wants you in the center of his will more than you want to be there.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You've shared with us about Abraham getting called and obediently following. Is there anybody else who maybe you would see yourself as in the Bible, a biblical character that maybe you can align yourself with?
Yeah. And let me just preface this with kind of a last comment on that issue of guidance. I think Satan wants us to be confused about guidance, and because it fouls us up. And I really feel like as we follow God, and as people in the scriptures follow God, he walks with us. It's his invitation, and there are
Mm.
multiple invitations, not just one. And I think that's what we see in scripture. So I mean, I love that the disciples were they were fishermen, they were normal people, and yet after their encounter with Jesus, they had a vision that led them out, and they changed the world. And that's the transformation as they took seriously what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But I love the Old Testament. So I spent a lot of time in the Old Testament, and it's not just I don't think I think it's just a coincidence, but I love the stories of Jonathan. So this is 1 Samuel 13. Jonathan is armor bearer.
Hmm.
One of the troubles I have with the Old Testament is the violence of those days, the battles, all that stuff feels really odd to us. But that was just the reality of those days, the violence and the war. But there's Jonathan. He's at the bottom of a cliff, and there's guys at the top making fun of God. They're just making fun of who God is. And he says to his armor bearer, let's go up there. God can save us by many or by few. There's two of them. They're climbing a cliff, but it's that principle that Jonathan was passionate about God's glory, and he could say, God can do this by many or by few. And his armor bearer, the guy, it's unbelievable. His armor bearer says, sure, I'll do that. And I'll carry your armor while we go up this cliff, right? We're in. And so that sense of being together. And then, that I think was the basis of Jonathan's friendship with David, that they both had a common passion for God's glory. I mean, David standing there with Goliath the Philistine could not abide that Goliath was denying God's glory, was offending, was making fun of God. And so he said, no, who's going to do something about this? And like, no one's stepping up. So David says, well, it's me, right? And he just steps up. One of my favorite philosophers is Puddleglum the Marshwiggle from the C.S. Lewis books, The Silver Chair. Puddleglum's thing was, let's go forward and take the adventure that befalls us. Jonathan, David, they did that. They stepped out in faith. And that bond is also what led Jonathan in 1 Samuel 23 to go to David when he was in trouble in the desert and help him find strength in God. And I think that's friendship, and that sense of being on a pilgrimage together, standing together for God's glory, even through the hard times, is really important. And not all of these are glorious times. I mean, another of my heroes is Naaman's servant girl, whose name we don't even know. I call her Sarah. From 2 Kings 5, who was a captive, a hostage, but she kept her faith in God enough to love Naaman and choose to reach out to his wife and say, there's a prophet in Israel. I would have prayed every day that Naaman would die of his leprosy. I wouldn't have wanted him to be healed. So to me, even in the worst of circumstances, we can still hold on to a God who can do great things, and we can accept and desire to love people. That's the adventure, I think, that God is inviting us to.
Wow. Yeah. So maybe to land the plane, and thank you for those great examples, but to land the plane here, if as you think about your own life, where God has brought you from and where you are now, and as you look ahead, if you were to answer that question, if you could do anything for the kingdom of God and knew you wouldn't fail, what would you like to do? What would you pursue doing?
It's probably going to sound really silly, but I would love to write a science fiction novel that really captured the glory of God and what it means to pursue Him in the fullness of wonder. You
Mm,
know, I mean, I love some of the C.S. Lewis stuff, and there's others who are writing, and actually, it's fascinating how much of the sort of story of Jesus is woven through, Dune with Frank Herbert. I mean, you can just see it. That story kind of pops up in so many of the classics kind of science fiction. But I'd love to be able to write a story that captured the hearts of people who have dismissed Jesus, who
mm,
think of religion as something that's old or outmoded, but who long for a world of wonder and of
Mm,
passion where you can be fully human in ways without limits. And I believe that's what God's calling us to. I think that everything that science fiction movies kind of uh, put in front of you and say, could this be possible?
mm.
Ultimately, the answer to that is in God, yes. And I'd love to write a story that just captured for people who've given up on church something of the wonder of being a follower of Jesus, because I think we sell that way short, and it's a dishonor to God when we don't tell those stories well.
Wow.
I'll buy a copy. I'll read it.
100%. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
if I don't write it, someone. I mean, yeah.
Hey, no, we support you all the way. Wow. There has been so many good things shared by you in this conversation that we have a lot to take away from. So thank you very sincerely. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
preparing for
thank you.
this and thinking deeply about your experiences and your background, as well as your calling and your sense of the adventure God's leading. We are really grateful.
It's been a privilege, and I'm just so grateful for, you know, all of the experiences, the opportunity to live in a Muslim context and have my Muslim friends help me understand Jesus better.
Mm.
That was such a gift. So yeah, that's what it's about.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you.